Hang on, I'm going to run the intro. What's up, everyone? Welcome to Chasing Signals. Not the same without the music. Can't just jump into the show. Got to run the ship chasing.
Did you start it?
The vibe. I started this live before the intro ran. I sat here for a second. Went nope. Got to run the intro. Forgot to run it. Yeah. So Chasing Signals. We're going to be breaking down the interesting trends as we look ahead to Week 14, touching on Ben's work with stealing signals, touching on some of the stuff I covered here on stat chasing. And let's jump right into it. Let's get started with some of the stuff that jumped out to us from the Rams and Patriots games last night. What do you make of the Akers emergence? I think that's the kind of the key takeaway from last night's game. I think just seeing Akers up there in snaps, getting a ton of work. Looking really good. He's been looking really good in some of PFF's underlying like efficiency metrics, like elusive rating, breakaway percentage all season. Now he's finally getting the work to go with it. How excited are you about Cam Akers, Ben?
Yeah, I think you have to be really excited. We talked a couple weeks ago about how he had that 61-yard run in week 12 and then got all the carries. It was the last play of the third quarter. He got all the carries in the fourth quarter. And I remember kind of asking you either on this show or on the Wednesday show, like we've talked a lot about how rookies can take over these backfields at the end of the season. We've been waiting on it. Is Akers suddenly going to be that guy? It hadn't seemed like he was going to be that guy. And we were kind of like, yeah, he could very well be Akers. And since then, he's carried 50 times in 2 games. I mean, he's averaged 25 carries per game over the last 2. And last night had 29 carries, 171 yards. They didn't go to anyone else. One of the things I talked about in Signals this week is not only did his emergence lead to like him kind of taking the Darrell Henderson role from earlier where they had one kind of clear lead running back, but this time around with Akers in that spot, it also cut into Malcolm Brown's routes finally, which he's always kind of been the lead snaps back and running a lot of routes. But with Akers, we got a ton of routes the week before last. I haven't looked at the routes from last night, but I have to assume same thing because the snap share was over 70%. I mean, he's a workhorse now. He's almost 80%.
Yeah, I think the routes actually is the one thing I'm a little concerned about for Cam Akers moving forward. Not that he didn't run routes. He ran a route on 63% of snaps, so he was out there running routes last night. 63% of dropbacks, Cam Akers was running a route. So he was very much a workhorse, and that route percentage is in line with that. However, he ran a route on 34% of his snaps, which I think points to game script. They weren't in a script where they weren't in a Malcolm Brown script. Now, what had previously been a Malcolm Brown script may not be Malcolm Brown scripts going forward. Cam Akers may not leave the field in the same way that he had in the past. So Malcolm Brown can come in and kind of play, that Leonard Fournette nickelback type of role that he plays. That, we don't know for sure, but that's like the one thing that we just didn't get an answer on with Akers. With the game script going the Rams' way, he was truly like a primary running back, was not ceding a ton to Malcolm Brown or Henderson. He got all 4 of the green zone carries. He got, he didn't score a touchdown and he had 4 green zone carries. So his expected point workload, RotoViz's expected point stat, 20.4 expected points, which is really, really good. He was barely efficient on that because he didn't get in the end zone. Obviously very efficient as a rusher, but just didn't add the touchdowns, didn't take advantage of those high leverage opportunities. So all of it's very bullish, I think, but I wonder how game script dependent he is.
Yeah, that might be a fair point. And I guess we don't know because we haven't seen him in this role in a negative script. But I think it's pretty interesting that Brown in positive or negative scripts had never been below. I'm looking at it now, 38% of the snaps all season in any game. And then in week 13, when Akers first took over and they beat Arizona, he played 13 snaps total. He played 16% of the snaps. So it was fewer than half of his previous or less than half. When you talk about percentages, I don't know if it's fewer or less. I think it's less than half of his previous low snap share. And then last night, he only played 6 snaps. He only played 10% of the snaps. So Brown could still play on some of these third downs, 2-minute drill stuff. I do see that point and that potential, but they've led in games earlier, and Brown was mixing in a lot more all year long than he has in this Cam Akers takeover.
Great point. Yeah, I don't want to overstate the uncertainty that we have here coming out of this game. Brown's role was definitely reduced. That's important to underline. Mike M pointing out we got the Jets next week, so probably not too worried about the game script, at least for the short term. What about this Van Jefferson, Josh Reynolds situation? This is one that you had flagged as interesting for just after week 13. But now we have this extra week 14 data point with them. Jefferson really came on in week 13, fell back a bit in week 14 in terms of the percentage of routes that he's running. He ran 25 routes to Josh Reynolds' 21 in week 13. And then in this past week, he ran just 9 routes to Josh Reynolds' 15.
Yeah, I think it's just a point about Reynolds. I don't know that, we should be considering Jefferson, but for a stretch there, Reynolds was running a ton of routes in week 12, right before these 2 games that you just noted. Reynolds ran a route on every single dropback, 100%. And just before that, week 11, 94%. Before that, week 10, 88%. Had some good games. I don't think you can use him anymore. At a point, it looked like he was, he had a game where he was clearly the lead, sort of the number one. Week 10 against Seattle, and then he still got 6 targets in week 11 and week 12. But this lull in week 13 and week 14, Jefferson is now taking back some of that role. And they were splitting in week 1 really early on and week 2 a little bit. But then Jefferson had kind of earned the full third receiver role. And now, Reynolds had, and now Jefferson has cut back into that. So you can't play Reynolds in pretty much any format, I don't think, right now.
Agreed. He's a fake deep threat. And by that, I mean his ADOT's 10, but it's the deepest of any of the wide receivers week after week. And he doesn't get targeted at a high rate. He's a fake deep threat for a quarterback who doesn't really want to throw deep. And now he's not getting all of the routes. So I completely agree. Ben, one of the things I like about the way we have the show structured is we can kind of talk about whatever we want as it pops up. So Zane Gonzalez here, questionable for week 14.
What's funny? I cut Zane Gonzalez in that league. We picked up Tyler Bass, so we are our single kicker situation is still. Obviously, the process was correct because it was just an issue with Zane Gonzalez, and we have Tyler Bass.
I'm a little confused why you haven't seen the leak in your game that you were able to cut a kicker and pick up another one.
Don't see it.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Where else do we want to go here? Let's talk about Houston and Chad Hansen, Kiki Cutie, and the usage there, because Chad Hansen was is it going to be Stephen Mitchell, who you accused me of making up last week, which I may have because he didn't play. And Isaiah Coulter was a guy that, I was all nervous in this league that we're in together where I'm trying to outtake Davis Maddock. I was worried Isaiah Coulter was going to cost me the 101 in that league by opening up in best ball. He did not, but I still lost out to Davis's god-awful team for the 101. And anyway, it ended up being this dude, Chad Hansen, who was previously a third-round pick.
For the Jets.
And is best friends with Patrick Laird, college roommate. So we need to get up to speed quickly on this Chad Hansen dude. Ben, what do you got on that?
Well, yeah, he hasn't played any snaps at the NFL level since his rookie season, I think it was. When I was looking at it, he played a little bit in 2017 when he was a 4th-round pick for the Jets. He had 9 catches, and then he hasn't been active in all of 2018 or 2019. I assume he's just kind of bounced around on practice squads. I haven't really looked at it. But what's interesting about him, and the reason I think like we should talk about him, is Kiki Cutie had a big week. Will Fuller got suspended. Kiki Cutie had a big week, had a 64-yard catch, wound up with I'm going to pull it up just to get the numbers right. He wound up with like 9 targets and 8 catches or whatever. Pro Football Reference is bouncing around on me. I tweeted about this the other day. Like, it's impossible to click on links. Yeah, 9 targets, 8 catches, 141 yards. 64 of that was on one play. And it was like a 48, air yard pass play where he ran a vertical route out of the slot. On 3rd and 10, Watson extended the play, found him basically wide open. I don't think he was actually running a ton of downfield routes. Other than that one big play, the rest of his profile was pretty similar to the Randall Cobb profile. And then Chad Hansen, we talked about this a little bit on Wednesday, but he wound up actually running more routes than Cutie. Cutie ran routes on 83% of dropbacks, and I think he's very interesting still. And we talk a lot about targets per route run as a stat. Cutie ran fewer routes and got more targets than Hansen, so his targets per route run was better, significantly better, and he has a little bit more of a pedigree, certainly. He's done some things in the past that we should be optimistic about him, but other than that one deep throw, which I think is making people sort of think that Cutie's role really changed with Fuller out, there wasn't much of a change with him being in the Randall Cobb role. Meanwhile, Hansen has 7 targets at a 15-plus ADOT, catches 5 for 101 yards, runs route on 94% of dropbacks. And, I'm getting like texts and questions this week about whether to, like, when people are in sort of tough spots where they're thinking about, one was asking about like Anthony Miller and some of the guys last night, like they had Jacoby Myers, didn't want to play him, and then mentioned that this Hansen guy's on waivers. I think he's available in a lot of spots. And like the way he was used, the fact that he ran a route on more dropbacks than anyone on the team. Cooks left for a little bit, but he was a full-time player in the Will Fuller role, running downfield routes and seeing air yards. And I think that's really interesting. They have a tough matchup with the Bears this week. But basically, I think the broad consensus is that Cutie was a smash from the fact that he was the big pickup target last week. And I think there's just too much optimism right now that Cutie will be consistently very, very good. He might be a high reception guy, but I don't think he'll maintain a really high yards per target, yards per reception, without having another big play like he did. And then meanwhile, there's not enough talk about this Hansen guy who I think has the potential to build on this. He had a 100-yard day again,
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think Cutie's interesting to me because he was out there for more than the Randall Cobb role. Like Randall Cobb ran a route this season. He's run a route on 66% of dropbacks. And last week, QT was out there for over 80%, 83% of dropbacks. So that's nice. It's nice that he was up above that. And he gets targeted at a high rate per route, like you're saying. But yeah, I think the ADOT, which was 12.7 last week, was probably a bit of a mirage. And Chad Hansen ran the most routes of all receivers last week because Brandon Cooks got dinged up. Almost, we were worried he had a concussion. And so Hansen was the dude out there for 94% of dropbacks. But, his weighted target per route run this year, in that game, was like good. It was similar to what Brandon Cooks has for the year. And it's, he's in a position of a deeper threat role where you'll sometimes see the volume bounce around on these deep threats, not just the yards per target is going to be more volatile week to week for a deep threat. But also I think the underlying volume is a bit more volatile too, because one pass can account for so much more of the volume. You know what I mean? Like there's like one additional 40-yard throw spikes up your volume so much more than what the underneath guys are getting. They need to they're going to get it more consistently. It's going to be a little bit more consistent week to week. So that said, I still don't really know. We have a great idea through one game of Chad Hansen's role. It could be even bigger than this potentially. There's upside. There still is upside from here. There's downside, but we don't necessarily need to talk about the downside that much because, to your point, it's not like there's that much excitement about this guy.
Right. I mean, that's sort of exactly the point. If you're in a desperation spot and he's on your waiver wire in season long and you're going into the playoffs and you're like, I don't have any good receiver options I feel good about, like, I have no problem with taking a shot on him. I know it's, a tough matchup on the road at Chicago, kind of a lower game total. Like, those are the issues. The game environment issues are the ones that you should be concerned about. But everything about his usage last week points to him being Will Fuller now. Obviously, he's not going to draw targets at the rate Will Fuller did. Obviously, he's not going to be as productive as Will Fuller was. But I want a guy running those routes in a Deshaun Watson offense, right?
Yeah, you do. You do. I think he's interesting. He's definitely in the dart throw conversation. Let's see. Let's touch briefly on some of these like running back situations. Miles Sanders was one. Can we just like why is this so terrible? and this is terrible as it feels.
I mean, yeah, they Philly had 0 high value touches last week. Only the third game all year for any team to have 0 high value touches, which is receptions and touches inside the 10. So they're like a legitimately bad offense for generating, green zone touches for the running backs right now. And they're also, particularly as Jalen Hurts took over in the second half, you worry about a mobile quarterback maintaining the same sort of target rate to running backs. And I think that was part of the reason that none of the Eagles running backs wound up with a reception. They had a couple targets. But you have Boston Scott running some of the routes. Now you have Jordan Howard active last week and playing 18% of the snaps and stealing, I think it was a half a dozen carries. And if they do get into the green zone, we don't know if they'll go to Jordan Howard at that point. He's a bigger back. He's obviously been that kind of vulture before. There's not a lot to like about Miles Sanders right now.
No, there's not. He had 6 expected points this past week. Jordan Howard had 2. Boston Scott had 3.5. It's disgusting.
Yeah,
it's truly disgusting.
I don't think you can play him if you're in like a playoff format. I'm going to bench him in a league where I'm in the playoffs this week, and I don't know who I'm going to start over him. I think James Conner's one that I have, and James Robinson in that league. But I think I'm playing 3 backs, and I can't recall who the third is, but it's a little bit more questionable. And I don't see a lot of optimism for Sanders unless he has, peak rushing efficiency, which he can do. But
yeah, I mean, I've got a league here. We're in the playoffs with Miles Sanders, and he is not in the starting lineup. I think he has got like work to do to get in the starting lineup because, so Ronald Jones and Kareem Hunt were starting over him, but David Johnson might miss. I think you probably start Duke Johnson over him. What do you think about that? Like, is he that far down for you?
If David Johnson's out, maybe.
Yeah, that's kind of, I think, where you'd start to figure, well, let's take a chance on him. Maybe there's more rushing efficiency with Jalen Hurts. The
other guy I'm starting over him is I pulled up that league is J.K. Dobbins, who I think is an interesting one to talk about too, because we didn't see him run. Like, Justice Hill was playing on some passing downs. We didn't see him run a ton of routes. I didn't actually pull those numbers after the Tuesday game, but I was hopeful.
Give me 1 second.
I was hopeful he would do a little bit more than what we saw. He scored the late touchdown, but otherwise he had, 60 rush yards. And again, that's not the profile you want to chase. A guy who only has rush yards and can't get the high value touches on either end. And he's no lock for the goal line work. Like we saw Gus Edwards get the rushing TD a couple weeks back when I think when Ingram was out, but Ingram could also wind up getting the green zone work. So you're kind of just talking about it between the 20s. Dobbins did get it in this game. He got the 5-yard touchdown late, and he looks great. He looks incredible, but you're really relying on that rushing efficiency, which, to be fair, should be very good. It's been very good for every back in Lamar Jackson, in the Lamar Jackson version of the Baltimore offense. But I'm concerned about him being just sort of a rush yard only guy, and you're hoping for touchdowns, kind of.
Yeah, and it looked like maybe he was going to be their version of a passing down back, but doesn't look like that was the case. I mean, at least in this past game, it wasn't the case because we're starting to see Justice Hill come in, and Justice Hill ran a route on 83% of his snaps. That was what Justice Hill was there to do. He's running routes when out there on the field. J.K. Dobbins only at 19%. That was the lowest of all the Baltimore running backs. J.K. Dobbins ran a route on 18% of the Baltimore dropbacks, which is obviously very, very low. So
that's even lower than I thought when I was saying that. I wouldn't have expected it to be that extreme. That's crazy. I mean, Dobbins has been running routes on but before he missed week 12, it was 50% in week 11, 45 in week 10, 62 in week 9, 59 in week 8. So moving back, like between 45%, 60% in every game since the bye. Now he's at, what did you just say, 18% of dropbacks?
18% of dropbacks.
So he's like he doesn't have that potential for receptions, which was already low because they don't throw to their backs a lot because Jackson just scrambles.
Yeah. And so you could make the opposite point here where they were in positive game script. And so I wonder if his routes would have spiked up if they were trailing, because I think Justice Hill is going to be kind of a mix in type of back regardless of the game script. They're not just going to start leaning on him. And so then you would think, all right, if Dobbins is out there, they're throwing more, Dobbins runs more routes. But Dobbins only had 38% of the snaps. Gus Edwards had 33%. Mark Ingram had 20%. Justice Hill had 11%. You're not really going to get there on that type of snap split. You need him. You're counting on touchdowns, and he might get the touchdowns, but those could easily go to Gus Edwards or Ingram. So while he did get the 2 green zone carries here, I don't know that that's necessarily like his role.
Yeah, he got him in week 1, and he had two short touchdowns, and then they were gone for several weeks. They went to the other guys. It feels very thin to chase the touchdowns. He has touchdowns in each of the past 2 weeks, but or past 2 games he's played, Dobbins, but it feels thin to chase those. And I think the best stat you just gave was the Justice Hill, 82% of his snaps he's running a route. Like that's what I thought I was seeing in the game without having dug into it.
Yes. I like looking at that because it tells you, like, is there a guy who's a clear pass down option? And Justice Hill doesn't play a lot, but when he comes in, he steals high value stuff. So, or the potential for high value stuff. Let's talk about Zeke, another one of these running backs who's kind of gotten gross here right when we need running backs to, be hitting their stride. We have a pretty nice matchup this week against the Bengals. Brandon Thorne highlighted them as an offensive line mismatch, I believe, on one end or the other. But the idea is that the Cowboys should be able to control that game. And, as I look at what we saw last week from the Cowboys, there's kind of a good news, bad news situation here. We've got Zeke. He had 25 expected points in that game. He had 3 green zone carries. He did not score. He left 11.6 points on the field, according to Rotoviz FPO. And that's going to hurt, but he had the opportunity. However, he only played 63% of snaps to Tony Pollard's 39%. So the 60-40 split that we've seen for weeks now continues. And I don't know that would necessarily change next week. Like if you look at either routes per snap, Zeke Elliott ran around on 50% of his snaps, and Tony Pollard ran around on 45% of his snaps. In other words, Tony Pollard was not coming in as a passing down specialist. He was coming in as a committee running back. So, he had 8 carries to Zeke's 18. Where are you at on that? Like, is Zeke, because Zeke, part of me feels like is kind of a really interesting play, someone I would feel comfortable starting. And then at the same time, him losing these snaps on an Andy Dalton offense is pretty painful. Yeah,
I think you said it well, especially that last point. Like the offense is not as good. We know that, and that's a pretty significant negative for him. He hasn't scored since week 5, which I think it was before the Dak injury. So, or excuse me, he hasn't had a rushing touchdown. He did catch a touchdown in week 11. But yeah, he had 5 touchdowns in the first 5 games, and he has, five rushing touchdowns. He caught a TD in the early part of the season as well. So he had 6 touchdowns in the first 5 games. He has 1 total touchdown since, and that's a reflection of their offense not scoring. And that's what happens with running backs in bad offenses. They don't get these opportunities at such a high clip. So you take that and you add in what you just noted about Pollard and everything. he certainly has potential if they lead and they win in a game. He did it in the Dallas game. He rushed for over 100 yards, but he's definitely a different player right now.
Yeah, I think you could see him getting in the end zone on a couple of short touchdowns or something. I think that's how he gets there, but I don't think that Zeke's just going to have the day where he just runs all over the Bengals, because I think they'll mix in Pollard. And so I think your best bet's touchdowns.
Yeah, that's a good point. Again, to get back to that Minnesota game, he rushed 21 times for 103 yards, but Pollard had that 42-yard TD in the fourth quarter. And Pollard ends up with 60 rushing yards and a touchdown. You can't expect Pollard to have these breakaway touchdown runs frequently, but the point I'm starting to try to make there is Zeke ends up with 21 rushes in a game where maybe in the past he has 25 or 26 and gets 103 rushing yards. Maybe in the past he has 125, 130. It kind of caps his ceiling, and that's the point you were making as well. Caps his ceiling for sure.
It caps his ceiling, although what we need from Zeke is now lower, at least in DFS, than what we used to need. And, certainly I think I do view him differently. I shouldn't say I think. I do view him differently than like Miles Sanders. Like, even though he's losing snaps, the offense is not what we want it to be. For this week in terms of start-sit, I feel pretty comfortable with Zeke in there. You're banking on touchdowns, but you probably don't have a better option, I don't think, given the matchup.
Yeah, it's not Miles Sanders bad, for sure.
Yeah. So another one of these guys where you're seeing split snaps is Derrick Henry, who's going to be, one of – I'm probably fading him in DFS this week, still figuring that out, but it's going to be a very, very scary fade if I do. And you saw last week 54% of the snaps going to Derrick Henry, 46 going to Jeremy Mcnichols. That's a lot. And Mcnichols actually had the more valuable workload. Mcnichols had the green zone carry in the game. He scored on it. But Mcnichols ran a route on 79% of his dropbacks, 79% of his snaps, excuse me. Henry at 46%, obviously not a passing down specialist, Derrick Henry, but makes me think, if this script goes differently, Mcnichols probably not someone that we need to worry about. Like, because you do think, like, how can Henry fail here if you're not going to play him in DFS? You're obviously starting him if you have him in season long. The Mcnichols path is probably a fake path for his failure, unless what you're really betting on is the Jaguars to control the game or to take the Titans out of a run-heavy script, which seems thin. I think I just talked about Derrick Henry.
Yeah, I mean, that's always I think what we saw last week is sort of always the risk with Henry. They were down. I'm in the game. They were down 38-7 at half, right? So that's not going to be a Derrick Henry script. Jeremy Mcnichols scored a 1-yard touchdown with 1:23 left in the game when they were down by 20. They're in hurry up offense at that point. He played the whole second half pretty much as they threw a ton. Ryan Tannehill ended up throwing 45 times for 389 yards. He hadn't thrown more than 31 times in like 6 weeks since the Taylor Lewan injury. They've been very run heavy with intent in neutral situations. This wasn't a neutral situation. This was a very extreme negative situation. And so we saw them pass a ton.
Yeah, and the Jaguars can't put him in that spot probably.
Right. I wouldn't expect. I think he's probably going to get a ton of work. Especially, it almost feels like when he has these types of games, they come back and they're like, okay, he's fresh. Like, I think he's going to get 30 carries in this game.
All right, this is one of the better questions we've gotten. My grandma's paying for Outback Steakhouse. What should I get? Also, Guyton, $3,200 too thin.
I mean, you got to go with a steak. You got to go with a bloomin' onion. I like the wings on their appetizer menu. They're pretty good. Kookaburra wings, I think they're called. I've been at Outback before in my day.
It's been a long time since I've been to Outback, so I'll let Ben take that one, and I'll talk about Jalen Guyton, who's running a bunch of empty routes. And trust me, I want to play Herbert this week. I've slotted in Guyton because the savings from Mike Williams and the double stack, it feels pretty nice. But then I end up scrapping the team because Jalen Guyton is not going to cut it. So that's where I'm at.
Leone's doing a pretty good troll here. You can choose what kind of steak you like. They have steaks. I like the sirloin.
Pretty good. Then what do you order at a steakhouse?
Typically, I get steak. It's just sort of it's a kind of a contrarian play, but sometimes you got to go with steak at a steakhouse.
Well, speaking of contrarian plays, like we're getting all of these comments. You just mentioned Derrick Henry. You can't fade Henry. D. Hember. Mcnichols got cut on Hard Knocks because he couldn't grasp a playbook. Yeah, that feels like the argument I've been fading against Ronald Jones for the last 3 years. So I don't mind. You've almost talked me into Mcnichols, Andrew. But yeah, so actually, let's talk about Ronald Jones, Ben. Is he the best play on in the entire start?
I mean, we're not allowed to not talk about Ronald Jones. Those are the rules, right?
You should ask your league manager to extend the trade line, extend the trade deadline, reopen it up, so you can get Rojo on your teams this week.
Yeah, I want to hear your take. I've always liked Rojo too, but you are the daily Rojo guy. I look to you for guidance on Rojo. I'm playing him. I mean, before the bye, Bruce Arians was saying right after their last game, we got to get Ronald Jones 20 touches. He said that kind of thing before. It hasn't panned out, but Jones has looked good. He made a good play in the pass game and stayed tiptoed down the sideline and scored. That was their last game. They're coming off a bye. That was the last time we saw them. He was basically their best offensive player. They look bad otherwise. So yeah, I think you have to think that they're going to have spent 2 weeks sort of committing to that, hopefully.
Yeah. So Ronald Jones, like what I want to like do a public service announcement about is the Arian stuff was not bullish before the bye. He was asked, because I actually went and watched that YouTube press conference to get a sense of like what he had said, the context. And the beat writer was like, dude, why are you playing Leonard Fournette? Why aren't you playing Ronald Jones? And he was like, because we were down. Because we got down early and we needed to have our best pass catching back out there, meaning Leonard Fournette. And then he's basically saying like how they really shouldn't be down and they'd like to be leading games. And in that context, he said we need to get Ronald Jones 20 touches. So he is still, I think, even coming out of the bye, going to be game script dependent. So the thing with Ronald Jones this week is you need to, I'm probably starting him in a lot of spots, but with the idea that they can beat the Vikings, or they can at least be in competitive scripts where they're not playing hurry up or they're down by like 10 plus points. In DFS, I think you need to keep that in mind too, that you're playing for a Bucs lead script if you have Ronald Jones in there. I think Ronald Jones is pretty nice value. His ceiling is, he can easily score multiple touchdowns, I think, if they're able to beat the Vikings. It could be a high scoring game environment. So I'm definitely interested in Ronald Jones this week. I'm probably going to be playing him in DFS, and you guys know that the probably is a lie. So I'm excited about him, but I think they're still the same path to failure that we've seen all season.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's well put. Let's talk about Mike Davis, though, because they're asking about it, and I know you had put this in our notes as well. So he ran routes on significantly fewer percentage of dropbacks. Basically, since McCaffrey came back and then was out again, Davis hasn't been the same sort of workhorse he was the first time McCaffrey was out. And that changes his expectation, his role. At the same time, DJ Moore's out in this game, which I think is a fairly positive note for Mike Davis, because they've had a pretty concentrated target share all year, or target tree, or however you want to refer to that. And Davis is still running the most routes of the backfield. I think he's maybe not expected to be an 80% snap back, and to some degree it's bounced around a little bit. But I like his target expectation, given that they have, it just means more reason for Teddy Bridgewater to dump off without having, even the threat of DJ Moore down the field, which we all know Teddy Bridgewater wasn't going to throw down to DJ Moore anyway, but I don't think he's going to throw to Brandon Zylstra. So that's sort of my expectation there.
What about what Leone's saying here? Samuel having to play wide receiver, does that help Davis, or I don't know if it does personally, but what do you think?
What has he been playing?
Well, I guess what he's saying is like they can't do as much like of the Curtis Samuel rushing in, at the 12-yard line or whatever that they've done. But I don't know that necessarily is the case. They can have, they can put Samuel in the backfield if they want to and have some kind of no-name dude out there on the outside or whatever.
I think that's an interesting take from Leone. But Samuel has still, I'm pulling it up, he still mostly played receiver, right? Yeah, like he had 3 backfield snaps in week 12, 4 in week 11, 5 in week 10. He does seem to get the ball a lot when he's in the backfield, but it's not a ton of snaps. And he's otherwise been in the slot or out wide for the majority of his snaps. So he kind of is playing receiver already, but maybe it's a boost for Davis. I could see that to a degree.
Yeah, my concern with Davis is like the point you're making about him getting the dump offs and stuff, I think is right. But isn't this a situation where they could control the game? And if you're seeing him lose, I mean, he only played 50% of the snaps in 57% of the snaps in week 12. If you're playing Mike Davis, like the whole point I thought was that like we're going to get a 75% snap share.
Right.
We're not getting that. Like if I have to deal with a floor that, let's be honest, they're coming off a bye. The floor is not 57%. The floor is like 40%. You know what I mean? Like they're just mixed in Rodney Smith, Trenton Cannon in week 12. And now they went on bye. Like if they liked what they saw out of those dudes, maybe they play even more than they did. I mean, Mike Davis got 2 green zone carries in week 12, didn't convert either. Left 6.3 points on the field in total. Has not played very efficiently for a big chunk of this Christian McCaffrey absence.
But you're basically saying
he really scares me.
You're saying the floor is lower because there's a lot of uncertainty, but you're saying the error bars are wider too, right?
The error bars are wider.
Mike Davis went, right after McCaffrey came back and then got hurt, Davis went 52%, 73%, 57%. So it bounced around, and there might be a case that, like, okay, maybe this old running back was banged up and they were rotating other guys in. Now that he's had a week to rest, he plays 80% again. I don't know.
100%. That's very plausible. So, yeah, I agree. I mean, and I guess you're not playing for floor in a GPP, and he's priced well in DFS this week, and I know Pete's excited about him at DFS. We were talking a little bit about that before the show. His ownership should come in. Well, his ownership looks a little bit up in the air right now. I'm not sure. We'll have to keep an eye on that. But certainly if he's like sub 10, he's a lot more interesting than if he's in the like 10 to 15 range. And I think, curious to get Leone's thoughts on that, as we go forward. But I don't know. He still scares me, and there's other options that I'm looking at in DFS that scare me a little bit less. So at this point, I'm having trouble with him. I do have a league with him where I'm in the playoffs that I probably will end up having to start him in, and I feel pretty comfortable with him as like a start.
Yeah. I'm fine with him as a start for sure.
All right, what else should we jump into here?
Well, we talked a little bit about Ayuk and Samuel, which I think you had some thoughts on. So why don't you break that down for us?
Yeah, Ayuk is a guy that I'm really excited about after this past week. The video that from Stat Chasing, we tweeted out the highlight video. I kind of broke down that there. But basically, Ayuk is operating as the number 1 wide receiver in this offense, at least he was last week. And we've seen him in that role previously, just not really with Deebo Samuel. Earlier in the season, when Deebo Samuel and Ayuk were both playing, Ayuk was getting a lot of deep targets. But Samuel was kind of the wide receiver 1 to the extent that Deebo Samuel can be, meaning that he still was getting a lot of short stuff, a lot of those kind of running backy type of plays, but he was also getting some of the more intermediate work. Ayuk has this role where he's probably going to be the deep threat in the offense when they do throw deep. That's often going to be Ayuk. But now, this past week, he was getting more of the intermediate work and operating really as the primary threat in the offense and a much more of a traditional wide receiver than Deebo Samuel. I'm really excited about Ayuk this week. I think, DFS-wise, he's someone I've been trying to get in, kind of do like little mini correlation with him and Terry McLaurin. I was sort of intrigued by. But I mentioned in stat chasing that if I had Brandon Ayuk and Chase Claypool in a league, in the playoffs, I would feel more comfortable starting Brandon Ayuk right now because Chase Claypool losing those snaps and routes to James Washington is not ideal. And Brandon Ayuk looks like he's like emerging over a Deebo Samuel in terms of his ability to get targets downfield. So that's where I'm at. Am I getting a little bit too exuberant here on Ayuk?
I don't think you're getting too exuberant on Ayuk. Just look at his recent game log. He's missed some games in between in two different stints, but going back to week 7, his last 4 games have all been very good. They've all been at least 75 yards. They've all been at least 5 catches. He's scored in 3 of those 4 games. He's been strong. Did I say 7 catches? I meant 5 catches. I don't know what I just said, but the Deebo side is more interesting to me because I don't know what the deal was last week, but in Deebo's 3 previous games, he had gotten a ton of free receptions on those jet motion tip passes. He didn't seem to get as many last week. And my immediate read on that is, was this scheme related? Was this something with the Buffalo defense? Buffalo is a well-coached team. Maybe Shanahan didn't feel that they could attack them in that same kind of way, which would be a theory that would lead, lend towards Deebo potentially jumping right back to a higher catch rate, which is not really a catch rate because he's literally catching tip passes. But Deebo had 9 targets last week. He caught 6 for 73 yards. The other thing he had was like 30-something air yards, which is not a ton. But we had talked the week before that even Deebo getting 8 air yards the week before that was interesting because back in week 6 and 7, when he had these 6-catch and 5-catch games, he literally had negative air yards because all of his touches, all of his receptions, all of his targets were behind the line of scrimmage. And then in week 12, he had 8 air yards, which was a ton of those. Plus, he got some looks downfield that got him back into the positive. This past week, he was well in the positive, which tells you he wasn't getting as many receptions behind the line of scrimmage. Those have been effective plays. I don't think they would just go away from that for their own reasons. I think it could very well have been scheme. And then you have Washington on deck next week, which is a tough front 7 and could potentially be another scheme that limits their ability to do that. But it also wouldn't surprise me to see Deebo get 6 or 8 of those in a game. Maybe not this week, maybe not, or maybe this week, but in the next couple of weeks, essentially.
Yeah, no, I think Deebo's still pretty interesting, and he functions somewhat like a running back, with that role, but it creates an opportunity for Ayuk to get a huge percentage of the air yards. So it's pretty interesting. With the Claypool side of this, Leone's leaving, so he called me out right before leaving saying I'm crazy for having Claypool behind Ayuk this week.
I love that he announces he's leaving like we care. Like, just leave, dude. Just do the Irish goodbye. Go away.
Yeah, everyone, I think by default, everyone Irish goodbyes in the comments. There's not what do you think? With what happened with Claypool, he ran around on 43% of dropbacks in week 13. James Washington was at 55%. Ben had apparently asked for more James Washington. I don't think that's ideal. And Claypool was at 71% in week 12. He had already been struggling to kind of get up to like a true full-time role in the offense because Washington had been, slotting in for around 30%. And now we see it move probably closer to 50-50. Maybe it's 60-40 going forward, but I think there's real risk of Claypool not really being out there all that often. And I don't feel that, as comfortable with him compared to Ayuk, who I'm really excited about owning all of the air yards in his offense.
Yeah, I think you have to be concerned for sure. Washington ran more routes the week before last. It was closer last week. You kind of just said all that, but there's a possibility that Washington sort of earned more playing time. This week is when Washington ran more routes. He cut into Claypool the week before. But anyway, there's we talked on Wednesday. Like my thought was maybe because Washington took a pass down the sideline, made a nice play for a long touchdown early, that he sort of got hot hand treatment the way we see with running backs. and that, they'll go back in the film room and be like, oh, hey, we only had Claypool run routes on 43% of snaps. That doesn't really make sense either. Let's go back and fix that, or 43% of dropbacks. And next week we see it kind of correct. But it does seem like Washington's not going to go anywhere. Having said that, if Claypool's at least running routes on 60 to 70%, he typically leads the team in air yards. What's interesting is with this split last week, they both had 4 targets, and they had 68 and 72 air yards. So you're talking about 8 targets, 140 air yards. That's like the role that we've seen from Claypool every single week. It was just split between the 2 this time, which is exhausting. Yeah.
Yeah, and Claypool can play. He's awesome. If he was out there, for his 70, 80% of dropbacks role, I'd be very excited about him. And I would say, yeah, you got to play Chase Claypool. He's a monster. But getting, and when I said 60-40, to be clear, I meant Claypool 60, Washington 40. I think sometimes, like exactly what you're saying, they're like, we need more James Washington. And then they're like, oh, we only played Chase for 40% of the drop. That seems low. And then you see him come back up. I think that's exactly what will happen. But I don't think it'll come back up to what we were seeing earlier in the season, where he was starting to look like he might become a full-time player in the offense. I think he'll be, still down a significant tier below where we're seeing Deontay Johnson and Juju Smith-Schuster.
But the point about the combined work we saw last week is necessary to make, because there was still a very clear, valuable deep role here. They just split it, and Washington hit on a long touchdown. Yeah. It could be if Claypool goes back to 60-40, like you said, that, first of all, that would mean that Claypool would probably wind up with 6 targets, 90 air yards, and then that he can get there on that with what he's done all year. So
he definitely can. Yeah. It's a good point. Yeah. I should clarify. It's more excitement about Ayuk that I say that, not true concern about Claypool, because I think Claypool will come back up. All right, you guys want to pause the show here? Pete's all right, let's see. What do we got? Well,
Eckler-Ballage is one I wanted to talk about.
Let's do that.
I think I am like legitimately somewhat concerned about Ballage's role. He's played well. The Chargers seem to commit to him relatively quickly after he joined the team. And then he missed in Eckler's first game back, when Eckler had this pretty significant role coming straight back from the hamstring, and had the 16 targets, and we were all stoked about Eckler. Again, he's going to be incredible. This is a great offense for high-value touches. I think they lead the league right now, or they're close to it. They certainly lead the league I think in recent usage, because some of the better ones, like the Saints, have dropped off. Yeah, okay, so the Saints still technically have 0.1 more high-value touches per week than the Chargers for the season. But in recent weeks, so like the past 4 weeks, the Chargers have 12.5 high-value touches per week. The next best team is actually Washington at 11.3. So you have this significant gap. The Chargers have been very, very good for receptions and green zone usage for backs all season. Very consistent, even with Eckler out. Doesn't matter who's in there. It's kind of flown under the radar because they've rotated so many backs. Like Troy Maine Pope had a 6 high-value touch game, I think it was, or 4 or something, which is pretty reasonably solid. You've had Josh Kelly mixing in, you had Justin Jackson, Ballage, and now Eckler. You've got a ton of guys that have accounted for these touches. So it's not a terrible thing if it is a split backfield, is my point. But I am a little concerned about Ballage coming in and seeing they both saw the same number of carries and catches in the first half of that game last week. Then it got a little out of hand. Eckler did have 9 targets, and he only caught 4, which is very weird. And we wouldn't expect him to have such a low catch rate. They're all short targets. So typically we would expect him to still see plenty of more receptions than that. And he's seen 25 targets in 2 games since he came back. So that's not a huge concern. But I do think it's almost like Ballage is worth considering starting in like seasonal formats, because he played enough. And even early, he got 3 carries on the first drive. He caught 3 passes. I think he could compete for the green zone touches in a way that would be bad news for Eckler's touchdown equity. Obviously, it's not necessarily to say that Eckler's not worth using, but this split is really kind of interesting to me as I'm looking ahead and trying to figure out, how highly I'm ranking Eckler, which he's still very good, and then whether or not I can use Balaj in certain spots where I need a running back in a seasonal format or something. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I would maybe think of Balaj a little similarly to how we were thinking of Zach Moss heading into last week or whatever, because this was a bad game script, one of the worst game scripts for the Chargers last week. And yet Eckler, who ran a route on 72% of his snaps, only played 60% of the snaps. So, what if it was a positive game script for the Chargers? Is it possible that Balaj gets more snaps than Eckler? Probably wouldn't, but it's possible, right?
Yeah, I think it's possible. Well, maybe not more snaps, but I think more touches could certainly happen because I think he could get a higher percentage of touches per snap, meaning he would be in on more running plays. I think it's certainly possible he could run the ball more than Eckler in a game right now.
Yeah, for sure. That's a good point. By the way, Pete is about to start putting curses on people in the comments here for not subscribing to the channel. Do subscribe to the channel. Take a little quick break here and plug our own channel. Please subscribe to the channel. Please like and subscribe. And we had a comment earlier, if I could find it here, of Stealing Signals. You got to subscribe to Stealing Signals. Someone had said it was the best $5 a month they've ever spent. So, and I just found it. Yeah. So you gotta get Stealing Signals. What are you doing? And also subscribe to the channel. Okay.
The season's over.
No, it's not. The best stuff's coming up. We gotta get some weeks 15 through 17 DFS wins, man.
That's true. I'll be writing them.
Yeah. Then we'll be churning it out. I'm a little bit concerned about Eckler, and I think Eckler seems like he's gonna be pretty chalky in DFS, right? So if that's the case, I mean, looking here on ETR, it looks like he's gonna be pretty chalky. So there's some paths to him failing.
Yeah, that's the way to put it, right? I don't know if we should say we're concerned about him, and I don't know if you would double down on that. We know he's going to get targets. We know he's going to probably be okay, but there's paths to him failing, right?
Yes, there's definitely paths to him failing, and I think you don't want to be worried about what happens if your running back is in positive game script. That doesn't seem ideal for a chalky, fairly expensive running back. You're starting Eckler in season long. We have him on our team with Crack Rock. We're going to be starting him there, but there's definitely paths to him failing, and there's paths to Balaj succeeding. So I like your call as him. He's not in the DFS mix, but I think if you need a little bit of a thin start on a playoff team with a hole at running back, I like that call too. Let's see.
What about this Russell Wilson question? I know you had some comments in the notes. I'm curious your thoughts. You asked, is this a Garrett spot for us or a Pete Carroll renaissance? And maybe you're directing that at me, but I'm going to force you to.
Yeah, no, that was directed at you, Ben. You're supposed to answer that that had a question mark after it for a reason. I don't know.
They've definitely I'll take a stab at it. They've definitely run more on early downs, and that's not a good sign, except for they didn't necessarily do that last week. If you go through and look, they threw on some early first downs. If you're looking at the game log, I almost was ready in Stealing Signals to blame this loss to the Giants where they lost 17-12 on the fact that, they've had this run first philosophy of late. It wasn't necessarily that in this game. They were pretty pass heavy throughout. It wasn't a major negative game script at all. I mean, it was for, late, it got a little bit out of hand, but this game was at most a 12-point game in the entire game, but it wasn't until the late third quarter that it even became a 2-score game. And so it was mostly just a low scoring. It was 5-0 at half. Seahawks were winning. It was mostly just a low scoring game. And Seattle did wind up throwing 43 times, or Wilson wound up throwing 43 times to only 22 rush attempts, and 7 of those were him. And he was sacked 5 times as well. So he dropped back to pass, over 50 times, I'm sure. I don't have the exact drop back numbers in front of me. And then they had running back carries of 15. So it was a very pass-heavy game plan against the Giants, and it didn't work. So that's sort of a weird one for me. They didn't continue to keep playing that way. which is probably a positive sign for Russell Wilson, that they're still willing to, that they haven't like fully Pete Carrolled into this, run in all situations offense. And they keep talking about how Chris Carson's banged up, but also Carlos Hyde's banged up. They don't seem to really trust the running backs, their health enough right now. So positive sign, I think from an intent standpoint that they were willing to pass. Obviously a negative sign that didn't lead to much production in what should have been a game at home against the Giants. That how did they not throw for more? How did Russell, I have a hard time explaining it. Russell Wilson threw 43 times at home against the Giants and averaged 5.5 yards per attempt. That's his second lowest yards per attempt all season, and not even really close to his season number, which is 8. He's 8 on the season. He was 5.5 last week, throwing it's kind of gross.
It is gross. I think with the Seahawks, they have an implied team total of 30.25, according to the Vegas lines. It's obviously a little bit concerning when they're 13.5 point favorites, because you're like, well, they don't need to throw. But if they end up hitting their team total here, they score 30 points. How does it not come through Russ?
Right.
And the Jets.
That's a good point too, though, about the line. They had I think it was Demario Davis went down early, and their backup tackle kept getting highlighted on the broadcast. That was what led to a lot of the sacks. He was getting eaten alive. I don't know if Davis will be back in this one. That's a good point. I actually do think the line played a big role. I wrote about that in Signals. I don't know why I wasn't remembering it right now.
It's interesting too, because we just lost Greg Williams, which is a bummer, because Greg Williams is so bad at his job that it's nice to be able to have him there. I don't know what the Jets defense is not going to be great, obviously, but the Jets had this weird thing where we talked about this last week. There was sort of a narrative that they wanted teams to pass on them. Last week ended up being kind of weird because they actually pushed the Raiders. So it kind of ended up being a situation where the Raiders literally had to pass to win the game.
I call it Demario Davis, and it's Jamarco Jones. Demario Davis is a linebacker for the Saints.
That's what I thought, but yeah.
This Chad Wheeler guy was getting highlighted big time. He
okay.
played but Jones actually played 72% of the snaps, so that's kind of weird. It wasn't even that. It wasn't like Iapati only played 67%. I didn't see an injury there, but maybe he went down as well. They had some backup offensive linemen playing some snaps, but
yeah, in general, this as I look at from a DFS perspective, I'm still pretty early on in what I'm trying to do for the GPP lineups I'm making, because there's a lot of indecision for me where you have Russell Wilson with a 30 plus team total, you've got Patrick Mahomes with a 29 team total, you've got Aaron Rodgers at 31.5. So I think this is going to end up being a really difficult quarterback decision week. And then you've got all these guys you've got, because of this, I think ownership might spread out on the wide receivers, Tyreek Hill, DK Metcalf. I think Devontae Adams is looking like he'll be very chalky, but there's a potential, if you have conviction to just play Mahomes and Tyreek this week, I don't know that the ownership is going to be that high. Anyway, it's getting a little DFS-y, but that's just one of the things that I think is the hardest thing for me this week to think through. Is I really like going to Russ and DK this week, but going to Russ and DK keeps me off of not just Mahomes, but probably Tyreek and potentially Devontae Adams and all these other expensive plays who I also like. So that's my biggest thing with Russ. I think Russ is going to put up points this week.
Yeah. So you're comfortable playing him in season long, but where do you land on that as you're kind of debating those quarterback? I haven't looked at.
I'm leaning towards Russ right now. Partly because I was reading Pat Thorman's snaps and pace article, and I'm wondering if, but I get it's going to come down to the ownership to some extent. I would really like the market to take some stances so I can take the opposite stances, because I don't know that there's that strong of a difference between them. If I could get Mahomes and Tyreek at much lower ownership than Russ and DK, I would be happy to do it. But I think I lean towards Russ and DK.
Yeah, the Jets are interesting defensively, because you'd think part of the reason they went pass heavy against the Giants is the Giants defend the run well. And that's sort of the book, been the book on the Jets. I've talked about in recent shows that the Jets have been a little worse against the run in recent weeks, but they were better last week against the Raiders. They did a pretty good job against Devontae Booker. And it was, Derek Carr beating them over the top throwing that wound up, and Darren Waller and just hitting them through the air that wound up kind of deciding that game. It wouldn't be that surprising. So on one hand, you're like, okay, the Seahawks blow out. You were talking about this, that their team total is very high. If they blow out the Jets, it would be hard to imagine how it wouldn't come through Russ. On the other hand, you could say, well, if they blow them out, maybe we'll see more of the Pete Carroll shenanigans. But the Jets seem like a team you would attack the way that they attacked the Giants, right?
You would think. Yeah. And another guy that is like in the mix for me, and I think probably worth touching on, is Herbert. And kind of what's going on with the Chargers, because they're obviously coming off this awful performance against the Patriots. We've got them in a decent spot with Atlanta here. Julio Jones might be out in that game, so that's potentially interesting. Calvin Ridley could be an interesting option there, depending on how chalky he ends up getting. But I've been playing a ton of Herbert this year. I almost can't stop playing Herbert. It's almost like a problem. I think I'm going to be back on Herbert this week.
I think it's a good call. We talked about this a little after the show on Wednesday off the air, but their team total is not great, and that's typically a red flag. But I do think there's a pretty reasonable argument to be made that their team total isn't great, in part because Anthony Lynn is not somebody that anyone trusts, and they continue to lose and they continue to not cover spreads because they're not a very well coached team, and they absolutely got destroyed last week. But yeah, they're home underdogs, and I like them in this game. Like I like them to actually win or at least be competitive or score points. So I think it's a good spot to identify where some of the field won't be on them. A lot of the guys that just look at team totals and trust them won't play a quarterback with a 23.5 team total as a home underdog, but there's a real legitimate chance that team total is wrong. And it goes significantly over for the Chargers, that this game shoots out at least. I don't want to say that I'm necessarily going to pick the Chargers to win because they find a way to lose every single week. And there's gotta be something to that. Especially when you see what they did late game 2 weeks ago. That was just the worst thing I've ever seen.
Total incompetence.
Yeah, but I think if I wanted to bet this, I would bet probably the over on their team total. If you can find that, and I know there's some places where you can do the individual team totals. Like it feels like they're going to go over that one way or another.
Yeah, and we've talked a little bit about this. I wanted to get some more of your thoughts, because it's like generally Vegas is not like directly setting a team total for that to be bet. Typically,
right?
They're more concerned with the spread. Like the biggest thing is the spread. And like, how can you have Anthony Lynn favored at this point? So that right there, then you're going to have a bad team total because you're an underdog. And so then you'd need to be projected for a shootout. And, it's like, there's a chance this shoots out, but it's not like a given. So it kind of makes sense why then, because they're an underdog and because it's a decently high scoring game by the over under, but not like off the charts, that the team total's bad. But I think if the Falcons and the Chargers are competitive with one another, as this line, which is 2.5, would suggest that they are, then, potentially the game does shoot out. I still think the Falcons probably win, but maybe Herbert gets there. And the thing that's been so nice about Herbert is you get, to go right to Keenan Allen. You can add in Hunter Henry. There's just like, it's more consolidated. And Herbert can add stuff with his legs. So he's more attractive to me than Matt Ryan.
And I think Keenan Allen's probably a really strong play right now. I mean, I'm with you in the trusting Herbert thing. And we've talked before on previous shows about sequencing and how we overrate trends. Last week, the big one I was talking about was Kyler Murray, saying he still has a ceiling, and we didn't necessarily see that, but he did play a little bit better. We didn't see him run a lot more either. So there does seem to be a trend there.
Where are you at on him with the Giants? Because now we have this. I mean, I think the general feeling is that
I'm playing him in season-long spots. I think it's It's the same as what we said last week. I still think there's a clear ceiling if he runs again. And I'm not buying, even now that it's a 3-week thing. I'm not buying that he's now it's not non-mobile, but not a big time rushing quarterback, because he's now gone 3 weeks in a row, 15 rushing yards, 31, 15, only 5 official rush attempts in each. That all ties a season low. And prior to this 3-week stretch, he had played 9 games. He was averaging 9.7 carries a game, 67 rushing yards per game. He's totaled 61 over the last 3 weeks. He was previously averaging 67 per game. He was averaging over a rushing TD per game. He hasn't rushed for a TD in the last 3 weeks. So, I'm not buying these 3 weeks against the 9 weeks earlier. It's a little bit more concerning. Certainly that there's a trend forming, but I still think in these situations, there's a clear possibility that it can swing back and he can have a 70-plus yard rushing game. And that's sort of the same point with Herbert I was going to make, is prior to 2 weeks ago, he completed at least 60% of his passes in 5 straight games and had thrown multiple touchdowns in every single game. He had one game that was only 187 pass yards. Otherwise, 278 or more pass yards in every game. Fairly consistent, fairly good. And then the last 2 weeks, his completion percentage has been below 60% both games. He's thrown 3 interceptions, only 1 touchdown. A lot worse numbers. He's thrown 52 and 53 pass attempts and not been very good, and they've been trailing and they've lost both games. Same kind of concept as the Kyler thing. I think that's sequencing. I don't take those 2 games as more predictive just because we saw them in the last 2 games than the 5-game stretch that was pretty consistent before. And I still feel pretty comfortable that Herbert everybody has a range of outcomes, but I still feel comfortable that Herbert has a ceiling to bounce back from that and play another really strong game. And I would expect that. He was really bad last week, and that's not good for Keenan Allen's numbers, and they weren't good. And that's why I actually think guys like Keenan Allen I think Allen's a really good play this week, frankly.
Yeah, I do too. And I'm going to try to have exposure to Allen one way or another. There's an interesting setup as I was looking at the DFS stuff. There's Russ plays late and Herbert plays late. So you can potentially do stuff like throw in some running backs early, see where you're at. You know what I mean? If you get Contrarian at running back early and then you go, my running back smashed, I can go ahead and play probably the chalkier side of this with Russ, or I can play the more contrarian side, something like Herbert. So I've been playing around with ideas like that, but I don't know. I don't want to end up where I don't have any exposure to Keenan Allen in particular, because I agree he's a really strong play. Let's see. We have some questions here about Duke Johnson. We touched on him for a second. People asking about him. People asking about Procise is potentially Procise over Miles Sanders. That's a no for me.
Yeah,
I think we found the line on Miles Sanders.
That's a no.
But what about Duke? David Johnson is now out on COVID, so we are going to get Duke Johnson as the lead back.
Yeah, I'm not super optimistic about Duke either. We talked a couple of weeks ago about him, but he basically, even when he plays his high snap share, typically snap share correlates really well with fantasy production. Even when he plays his high snap share, he doesn't seem to get the high value touches, but he also doesn't even seem to get many low value touches. It just becomes a pass heavy offense. What's really weird is he catches 6 balls last week when David Johnson plays and rushes for a touchdown and is the lead back, and Duke only has 2 carries. He had 6 catches combined across his 3 starts in the prior 3 weeks. And I guess he played a pretty big snap share the week before that as well with David Johnson out. He caught 4 in that game. But still, 10 catches over 4 games where he was kind of playing as the lead back, played over 70% of the snaps. But I don't think that's necessarily an accident. It's not, it is interesting now Fuller's out and he caught 6 balls last week. But going into his, stretch as this lead starter, he had 5 receptions in sort of a part-time role. It's almost like when he's playing as the lead back, he's not likely to catch as many passes as when he's coming in and running routes solely for that purpose. Does that?
Yeah, I know what you mean, but it's weird. Although he did lose a rushing or a receiving touchdown to CJ Procise. Johnson did when he was the lead back. So maybe they do kind of have the guy who mixes in as more of the passing down back, even if the guy who used to be that guy is now starting, which is a bit odd. But I know what you mean. Yeah,
the one big play he had in that game was a 33-yard touchdown where he was running a downfield route, and like that's amazing to see. But it's not something I bank on in future situations. And at Chicago, it just doesn't feel like a good spot for rushing efficiency. So it comes down to can he catch enough passes, and I don't know that I love it.
Shout out to Henry Muto in the chat, who had the number one team overall in the FFPC regular season. Sat Cam Akers. So for any of these start sit questions, there you go. It's hard. It's hard to know who to start, who to sit. At least he didn't get in the end zone, Henry. We talked about the green zone work. Could have been an even bigger day for old Cam, and at least you got him for the next 2 weeks. All right, we haven't talked like any tight ends, right? So what's going on with
because the position sucks.
It does sucks. Jordan Akins was a guy that we talked about as like maybe like a fake opportunity last week. Someone that I actually did kind of sprinkle in a little bit in DFS last week, but didn't play all that much of. I think I had him like literally in one lineup, maybe two. And now everyone else hates him because he just burned everyone who did play him in DFS. Is there anything here? I mean, he did run a route last week on 75% of dropbacks. He maybe did see a little bit more work than he had in the past with Fuller out. Just one game, but it's certainly possible that theory that he would get more involved with Fuller out was actually true, even though the production didn't follow. What do you think about like going back to Jordan Akins and DFS, and what do you think? Is he like startable and in tight end premium type of stuff?
I think you hit on the reason that there's at least some interest. He ran around on 75% of dropbacks. The previous weeks when people cared, he was running routes on 56, 57% of dropbacks. The fact that it ticks back up here with Fuller out is actually vaguely interesting to me. He didn't see a lot of work, but now it's almost like now that there's a reason to actually be excited about Jordan Akins, no one's going to be. So that's backwards. I don't know that I'm going to be playing him everywhere, but you should be more excited now than you were last week. It's kind of my opinion. I mean, again, get back to sequencing. Like the reason people were more excited last week is we were closer to Jordan Akins actually doing something, and now we're further away from it. But like if he's running more routes, he is sort of the same guy that he always has been. If you thought he had the potential to back up the 5 for 83 receiving line he had week 11, and you haven't seen that in week 12 and week 13, the bump in routes is actually an indication that might be more likely to happen in week 14 than you probably should have thought it was likely to happen in weeks 12 and 13, right?
Yep. Yeah, the bump in routes is a big deal. And 75% of routes for tight end is a lot. It's not an elite share for tight end because you will see guys like Logan Thomas, who's basically just a wide receiver, tight end designation. You're not gonna see him up at that level, but 75% for like a guy playing more traditional tight end is very strong. So I think that's, I agree. I think he's more interesting than he was when he was chalk. So going back to him is
the guy we compared him to last week was Cole Kmet, and I was real excited about Kmet. Had moved up to 66% routes, and by comparison, Kmet went back to 54%. And Graham came up a little bit. Kmet saw more targets, and this is another one where, like, if you're just following the targets, before we were saying, look, Kmet hasn't really seen enough work yet, but the routes have been there, and we actually got that paid off in week 13, but the underlying routes went down, and it got a little more concerning. And so I almost want to say with Kmet, don't be too optimistic about what we saw with the targets and the touchdown and the production, because his routes, it didn't continue to skyrocket. It looked like he was trending towards maybe a 75% route share like Akins got. So now it's the other way. Now I want us to go back to Akins over Kmet.
Agreed. Yeah. Now it flips back.
Yeah.
Henry's asking about DeAndre Swift. And to me, it's like he's a
what a headache he is.
Yeah, literally. I think I would be sitting Swift. I'd be sitting Swift. I'm not touching Swift in DFS, but I think I would literally, if I have any other options, I'm sitting Swift. What about you?
I want to play him so bad. Like I have a league. I might play him in one league if he plays. I don't know what's going on with him, but I just want to play him. So we saw that he was trending towards playing it. Like, I guess that report's today.
Yeah, but we heard the report last week that he'd be in kind of like this package like he was to start the year. So I don't think you're going to get a capped ceiling. Now it's DeAndre Swift, so maybe, on limited touches, he still scores a touchdown. It's not like he can't provide you any kind of ceiling, but there's only so bad that he can burn you by sitting him.
Would you play Dobbins or Swift? Because the thing
I play Swift.
You'd play Swift.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's sort of what I was going to say. The thing about him is in a limited role, I would expect some receptions, and I would expect some cheap points that Dobbins might not have access to. Agreed.
I think, in full practice today for Swift, John points out. So I would play Swift over Miles Sanders, who, we've talked about. So I guess I shouldn't say like I wouldn't play him, but like if I have any other option,
Dobbins is the option that I have in that league where I have Jonathan Taylor in this league too, and Myles Gaskin. Oh, I have Kareem Hunt in this league too. I could play Hunt over Swift.
See, I think I'd play Hunt.
Yeah, that might be fair. I want to play Swift though. I'm so excited about him.
I'm excited about it too. I have him. I think he's like 8th overall in my dynasty rankings. Like I'm freaking pumped on him. But I'm worried about this week. I'm worried about him because.
What about Taylor? We had this on the notes. Taylor got this much bigger role. It's very exciting. But then Nyheim Hines got goal line work and got a carry on 4th and 1 late in the game, in a game where Taylor was running really effectively. Like what?
Brissett got a 3rd and 1 carry in that game. Taylor, I believe, had 1 2nd and 4 carry, and that was as close to short yardage as Jonathan Taylor got. So I don't know. How
does that make sense?
It doesn't. It doesn't at all.
And I've been saying all year.
What are you thinking?
It's insane. And he Hines got the green zone work. He did score on a short green zone touchdown on a play where he kicked it outside and like they just didn't contain the edge. He rushed 6 times for 10 yards against Houston. He's not like a good running, but I love Hines. And I think he's a very good when used effectively. He can be an efficient runner. He's certainly a better pass catcher and can be very explosive in the pass game and so multidimensional. But he's not that running back. He's not a between the tackles 4th and 1 running back. And I know Taylor has had troubles with vision, and everyone's talked about his run into his blockers and stuff. He rushed 13 times for 91 yards in this game and actually looked like he was turning the corner that we've been talking about. Be patient. Maybe he'll turn that corner. He took a screen pass or a swing pass, 39 yards for a touchdown. He's a lot bigger. He doesn't just get pushed back. He's, again, not been great in short yardage situations, but he's not going to get blown up the way Nyheim Hines is going to get blown up because he's 30 pounds heavier. Like, he's a lot. And Jordan Wilkins, I've been saying all year, is just a guy. And he continues to look like just a guy every week. I don't get why people think. I mean, Reich has even said we think we have 3 first-string running backs. How is Jordan Wilkins? What has he done?
He's capped Jonathan Taylor's upside is what he's done.
Yeah, exactly.
Jordan Wilkins had 19% of the snaps last week, which is a problem when you've got Nyheim Hines out there. Nyheim Hines running around 65% of his snaps. Obviously, more of the passing down guy, but then also getting the green zone work, also getting the 4th and 1 rush. So that sucks to be Taylor when you have a thorn in your side in Hines, but then with those additional 13 snaps that he lost to Wilkins, he only had 33 snaps, Jonathan Taylor. He only had 48% of the snaps in the game. Still managed to get 15 expected points in that game, was played very efficiently, added 7.1 points to a 15.4 expected point workload. Pretty great, but that's, basically that's a way of saying he went 13 for 91 as a rusher, and he went 3 for 44 and a touchdown as a receiver with the long catch that was, I don't want to say it was fluky, but it wasn't like.
Yeah, it was fluky.
Yeah, it was a little fluky.
Broadly, he's played in his last 2 games that he's played, he now has 114 yards and then 135 yards. The knock on him had been he's not been very efficient. He's not good. People were literally saying he's not good. And we were saying, for most of the year, I know in Signals, and I'm pretty sure you kind of had the same line, like rookies a lot of times are better in the late part of the season. The comparison I drew when he got very, very limited usage in weeks 9 and 10 was Miles Sanders last year, who got his lowest usage around that time. People didn't really, I think, remember that. Sanders was getting used a little bit more early, and then like week 6 to 8.
Is this like a tradition that they use? Because they're doing the same thing this year with Miles Sanders.
I don't know. But the point is, like, they gave Sanders this role. He wasn't ready. He was doing some things wrong. He was making rookie mistakes. So they scale him back a little bit. And then, yes, I know Jordan Howard got hurt, but he winds up in a much bigger role late in the year. Taylor's sort of been on this exact same trajectory. They gave him a lot of work. They found reasons that he wasn't doing well enough. He started to get limited a little bit. And then they're like, wait, we can't just have Nyheim Hines and Jordan Wilkins be our backfield. This guy's our most talented player. We're heading for the playoffs. We want to get him going. And they've given him 26 and 16 touches the last 2 weeks. I know his snap share is not amazing, but he's getting the ball. 15 plus touches for a guy who's now playing efficiently, and I always thought was a really good prospect all along. I want to play,
Yeah, in a good matchup as well.
If you talk about like DFS, he's not going to carry high ownership again until he has a monster game.
Yeah, and he's in a strong matchup as well. You got the Raiders. 1 are just not a very good matchup against running backs, and 2 have been kind of all over the place in terms of like, is this team terrible, or are they kind of a team that can push the Chiefs, or are they a team that's going to lose to the Jets outside of them being gift wrapped the game on the final play? So, and then obviously they got beat down by the Falcons. So if a good Colts defense can control the game, then you could see Taylor just eat. But I want that to be right. But the thing that scares me about it is like, it's kind of like the thing with Eckler, where it's like, okay, we get what we want for a running back and that they're in positive game script, and then it's still ruined by usage. Like with Eckler, Balazs could get the goal line carries. Here we could see, Taylor played in positive game script. He got 18 rushes, but he also lost 2 short yardage situations, 1 to Wilkins, 1 to Brissett. That's like almost the most likely outcome. So it's like really
exhausting.
It's kind of exhausting.
Right. Yeah.
But if you want to talk about him as a contrarian play, like he's an awesome contrarian play.
Right. And I think if you have the options, like I just said, where I'm looking at like Swift, like he's ahead of Swift. He's ahead of, for me, he's ahead of Kareem Hunt. Like I think Taylor has enough of a floor after these last 2 weeks to feel pretty comfortable about him, and then has a ceiling as well. Like there is the potential that Taylor pulls an Akers, basically. That's still there. I know we've been talking about it all year, and everyone gets like each additional letdown, everyone gets more certain in that the confirmation bias is what it is, right? Gets more certain that like, no, actually Jonathan Taylor's bad now. He's never going to do it. He's never going to do it. Well, we're saying that about Cam Akers. Like anyone who feels that way, like I promise you've missed every single rookie breakout. Like that's the thing. Like we keep talking about how these rookies break out unpredictably. We don't know when they're going to happen. And sometimes it happens. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes these guys go the whole rookie year and don't do great. But you can always just say that it's not going to happen until it does. But like there have been rookies that have broke out. And for the people who take that stance, they need to see it first. They've missed every single one. Right?
Yeah. I think that's a good way to put it. What I will say is, with Cam Akers, we saw things starting to trend in the right direction, and that's so much more. It's so much better for your brain. I'm not saying it's even provides a better signal, but it makes it so much more palatable when you see like if Cam Akers had been on the main slate, I would have been really excited to play Cam Akers. I actually tried to fade him on Showdown because I thought he'd be really popular, which obviously did not work out. But on the main slate, I would have liked him a lot because he had 63% of the snaps in week 13. He had 20.2 expected points. He had 7 green zone carries. Like that was, they were showing their hand on Cam Akers. Like, we want to get this guy more involved. And it hadn't quite popped yet, but it was looking like he could have this big breakout game, which he then did have as we discussed earlier in the show. With Taylor, it's not impossible that they could hand him that, but it feels like I'm going to know, 18 minutes into that game that I'm screwed and my day in that lineup is ruined when I have Jonathan Taylor, because they're just like mixing in everybody and they're using other guys in short yardage. And it's just going to feel so frustrating because they haven't really signaled that they're going to go away from that. It's just that we think they really should go away from it. And I think eventually they will go away from it, but I don't know if it's going to be this week.
But he had 55% of the snaps, 48 the last 2 weeks. He's giving up half the snaps, and he still got 26, 16 touches, right? So, like, the touches, he can, like, I think I view that a little differently, where I still am expecting, like you said, I'm still expecting the exhausting usage.
Yeah.
But I almost am feeling like we might see why we were so optimistic about Jonathan Taylor behind a good offensive line in against, a bad run D. He did it last week. He was very efficient. It would not surprise me if he came out next week and had a long run like Akers. Like, when I was saying Akers, it was more or less the efficiency than the massive snap share. I don't think he's going to go up to an 80% snap share like Akers did. But if he starts to rip off some longer runs and start making some plays, he just made the play in the swing pass last week, and he was efficient as a runner. Maybe the culture like, hey, we do need to bump him up a little bit. And then on top of that, he's just doing well with the touches. And we start to see a very productive line.
Yeah, he's cheap Nick Chubb. And that's how I think I'm going to talk myself into him.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Like 50% of the snaps, Nick Chubb gets there. Why is Jonathan Taylor so different than that? It's a great way of putting it.
Yeah, and I think you're in a position here where you can see the long runs, just like when Chubb's hitting, it's often due to these long runs. And I think Taylor, he kind of profiles pretty similarly, I think, when, like, in the games where Taylor and eventually smashes, and I do think there will be those games, I think there's going to be a long run as a big component of that.
Yeah, exactly. What's funny, though, is when he doesn't, everyone's going to say, see, told you he was super dumb. And I'm just going to tell you, or he's super bad. And I'm just going to tell anyone who wants to go there with it that you're wrong and dumb.
A pre call out.
I know what you're going to do when he fails this week. It's a probabilistic thinking. Like, we're making a gamble that he has that potential, and he also has the potential to do bad. We already know that. We've seen it a million times. I'm not denying that he has the potential to also go back to 12 touches and average, 2.5 yards a carry and piss me off this weekend. That's possible too. I won't deny that.
Yep. Anything else we should hit on before we get out of here?
JD Mckissick with Antonio Gibson, I think is interesting. Another one where we talked about a lot of high value touches. He played a lot more. He ran very nearly his most routes per dropback of the year when Gibson left early. Peyton Barber's going to steal some work, particularly the early down grinding type work. But it wouldn't surprise me if Mckissick had 10 catches again this week. He did last week. Where are you at on his value? I mean, limited ceiling, but
limited ceiling is where I'm at. Yeah, I think you have to. He's someone that I'm totally comfortable slotting in. If I want, it's like, hey, if I need 15 PPR points out of this spot, and let's say 10 to 15 would be fine, then McKissick will be fine. Like, I think, but the story with McKissick is that he'll often get a pretty solid workload and then underperform that by a fair margin because he's JD McKissick. But last week he had 20.5 expected points. That's like an elite running back workload. He left 2.7 on the field, which is pretty good for JD McKissick. So I think I wouldn't expect that big of a workload. You were seeing such a big workload because he was getting used a ton as a pass catcher. And I agree, if they have the chance to, they'll lean on Peyton Barber a bit more. But hey, if you get 15 to 20 expected points, you'll get 10 to 15 actual points from JD McKissick. And so in season long, in playoffs where you don't have the strongest running back options, I think he's definitely in play. He's a pretty viable option.
And I think a strong floor, because there are Alex Smith's going to throw to the running back position. He has every game. So 10 to 15 might feel like more or less his median or towards the ceiling, like you were kind of saying, but also like his floor is like 8 to 10, you know?
Yeah, I think that's true. Like he's not going to leave you with a 0. Like it's almost, I'll give away Leone's projection on him. He's got 14.4. So he's up at closer to 15, right? So yeah. But it's tough for me to like, I mean, can he get to 20? Yeah, he can get to 20. The thing with Mckissick is like, there's no scenario where he scores like 40 points this week, right?
Yeah.
So, but I guess, if you're kind of punting off the spot if you're playing him in DFS, although he's 4,900 on DK, so it's not like there's actually some opportunity cost there because there's some really
interesting philosophical discussion because you can still win a GPP with a 4,900 running back scoring 15 to 20 points. Like that's not the end of the world. Like you can still win.
You can, but not to get like too in the weeds on the pricing on DraftKings, but there's guys this week like Jonathan Taylor we discussed is 58, Myles Gaskin's 56, CEH is 59, Ronald Jones is 61. So there's guys with I think higher ceilings.
Yeah, you need those guys to fail in conjunction with Mckissick being, the upper end of his outcomes to even have that 16 to 18 points be good enough. You need everyone else to fail. Yeah. And I don't know, there's enough options in that range to where he's not that interesting to me because you don't even have to, I'd just rather play one of those guys. If I'm down here in this range, I'd rather try to find the 700 to get to Gaskin or whatever. So that's where I'm at in DFS. I probably won't have any of them, but the last one I wanted to ask you about was Jalen Hurts. I want to know what you think about him.
I got some thoughts, man. I got some thoughts on the Eagles coaching staff is just so bad. I think they were talking about this on the Swolecast where it's just like there's a chance that they just do not change the game plan at all and Jalen Hurts is just running the Carson Wentz offense. What I would say is that he's playing the Saints, which is just the worst spot for him to get his first start. They've just been really, really stingy defense. Then on top of that, it's like, okay, you're playing Hurts, but like, who are you stacking him with if you're playing him? Because they're rotating the 4 wide receivers on the outside like pretty evenly. And arguably like Alshon Jeffrey is, trending towards getting the most run there, which obviously not playing him. Rager, he got 63% of the routes last week, which was the most, but that's not a lot. I mean, he's like running like kind of low end tight end starter level of routes. And you got Greg Ward leading the wide receivers in routes at 71% because he runs out of the slot. But that's where we're at. The slot wide receiver, because he has the slot role locked down, is your quote unquote number one wide receiver. Even the tight ends now are flipping with each other where, Goddard's routes came way down with Ertz back. It's just disgusting with the skill players. So I don't know what to do with the information that Hurts is starting. I'm not expecting that much from him. I don't want to play like naked Hurts in DFS. If you have him in season long, like
let's say theoretically you have a season long team, purely theoretically that had Dak Prescott and then had Joe Burrow and then had like Daniel Jones a couple of weeks ago, and every quarterback you start gets hurt. Would you be considering starting Jalen Hurts this week in a playoff matchup? Total theoretical scenario. Let's say, like, hypothetically, you also have Mitchell Trubisky and Tua on your team because you've now rostered 3 quarterbacks because every quarterback you play gets hurt. Again, totally theoretical.
I would start Trubisky over him, I think. And
yeah, that's who I have.
I think it's close. I would start Hurts over Tua probably. Actually, I don't know. Against KC and you just hope for a shootout, I'd probably go Tua too. I'm pretty worried about Hurts. This is a really tough spot to get your first matchup. First game, not just because of the matchup, but because I think these coaches are terrible. I don't think they're going to set them up for success.
I'm in a 2 QB league that Mike Clay runs. Me and Sean do it together. We've done it together for quite a few years, and we're in the playoffs. And part of the reason I asked you this, someone whose opinion I really respect, JJ Zachariason, we're playing him in this matchup. in the playoffs, and he started Hurts over Jared Goff last night. He benched Goff in this 2 QB format. And I think, that was a reasonable enough call. Goff only, he threw for under 150 yards, and I don't think he was a smash last night. He ended up with a pass and a rush TD and did okay. But that did kind of stick out. I think I would have probably played Goff, and so it made me think like
I would have played Goff too.
Maybe I'm underselling
wrong.
Hurts' rushing ability a little bit.
Yeah, PMAR saying Hurts. Every running quarterback has succeeded in their first start. I don't know if that's statistically accurate, but we'll give it to him. PMAR actually throwing in some interesting info here on Gibson, saying he thinks he'll be back week 16. That'd be nice. You know what I will say just real quick on Gibson, because I am so up in the air on Hurts, is that I do kind of like the idea of the team getting a chance to fully see Peyton Barber for what Peyton Barber is, and then once he's been exposed as the full Peyton Barber, they can just ride Gibson once he's back, because I want Gibson to be set up for workhorse status in 2021. And I actually think the team going, oh God, this is so gross when we don't have Antonio in this role, might be helpful.
Peyton Barber went 14 carries for 23 yards with a long of 5 last week. So
yeah, so no, he had a good game for him. I shouldn't. Yeah, but I guess you're right on Hurts. Like, just the rushing alone could. I mean, maybe I would play. I don't know. I just think like Tua is probably not going to bomb for you. So if you're just looking for like a solid start out of the quarterback position,
Trubisky feels like he could bomb. He catches up in garbage time sometimes, but if he doesn't get there in garbage, like I like the matchup with Houston, but they might ride Montgomery, whatever, yada yada. And Trubisky can just be so bad at football that he can't put up a good line. It's almost like the Jared Goff point. Like that's the concern with Goff. Goff can play so bad at times that you don't get any fantasy points because he's just not usable. I don't want to be starting Mitchell Trubisky in a playoff matchup because I think he can legitimately lose me a matchup by putting up a 5 spot with three picks,
Yeah, I agree. I think I wouldn't play Trubisky over him. I still think I'd play Tua over him, but
yeah, it's a tough one. This is what we've decided.
All right, I think we can call it there unless there's anything else we should have touched on but didn't. But yeah, let's wrap it up. Thanks for tuning in. This has been a lot of fun. A great addition to just kind of my process through the week. So I hope you guys are enjoying it. Please please sign up for Stealing Signals if you have not done so. Please subscribe to the channel. Please like the video here, and we'll be back. I'll be back on Monday for stat chasing, running through all the stats, and then we'll be back on Wednesday, and we'll be back next Friday at 4 Eastern for another edition of Chasing Signals. For Ben Gretch, I'm Pat Kerrane. Peace out.